The forest kingdom breathes in silence. Welcome to Fantasy Journeys. Chapter 7. A letter sent 600 years ago. Senna returned when the moss began to be visible. She had been there as they descended into the valley, a pale suggestion at the edges of stones and root systems, something the eye registered and set aside as a trick of the fading light. But as the valley's canopy darkened and the filtered afternoon light thinned toward its lowest point before true evening, she became undeniable. The cliff face began to show her a look-white luminescence that was less like light being produced and more like light being remembered, as if the moss had spent all day absorbing what passed through the canopy and was now, in the failing of it, returning what it had kept. The stones held their warmth. The light did not. Lira had moved from the stone table to the channel's edge, where she could see more of the cliff face and where the sound of the water was fullest. All three registers present and balanced at this point. The low resonance and the mid-current and the high bright thread of the northernmost source, all three arriving at this spot in proportions that felt, in a way she could not precisely account for, correct. She had the map. She was looking at the personal notation with new eyes, reading each phrase not as description of a feature, but as a note made by someone who knew this place so completely they had stopped explaining it and started simply recording it. The way you recorded the weather, not for someone who had never experienced weather, but for yourself. Tomorrow, when you might want to remember what a specific afternoon had been like. The phrase she was reading when Senna appeared. The place the water makes when it knows where it is going. She heard the footstep. This time she heard it, barely, and turned. Senna stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the cliff face with the same expression she brought to everything. Assessing. Not the assessment of uncertainty, but of someone confirming that what should be happening was happening. The moss bright enough now that its light reached them faintly from across the valley floor. Senna looked at it the way a person looked at a fire they had lit, with the quiet satisfaction of completed work. She looked at Lira. She looked at the map tube. She turned and walked toward the cliff face. Cael was already on his feet. He had been sitting against a broad elder trunk with his journal open across his knee, pressing the valley floor plants into the back pages, and he rose with the economy of motion of someone who had been partially attending to their task and partially attending to the rest of the world. Prepared for this, without knowing he was prepared. He tucked the journal inside his coat. He did not need to look at Lira to know she was following. They crossed the valley floor in Senna's wake, through the ground cover that absorbed their footsteps, past the channel and over the near bridge, Lira's hands finding the stone without looking, knowing the width of it now, and toward the cliff face where the moss was brightest. The light from it at this proximity was enough to see by, not well, not with the clarity of daylight, but with the specific quality of bioluminescent light, which showed form without color, shape without shadow. Everything was equally present and equally pale. Senna moved along the cliff face with the confident unhesitation of someone navigating a room they had lived in for decades. She passed two openings without stopping. At the third, narrower than the others, set at a point where the cliff face curved slightly inward so that the opening was partially obscured by the overhang above it. She paused. She touched the stone beside the entrance in a gesture that was not quite the same as the gesture she had made beside the map's margin, but was related to it, both involving contact with the space beside the significant thing rather than the thing itself. She stepped inside. The passage was narrow and turned once, gently, before opening into a space that Lira felt before she saw the change in acoustics from the passage to the room was immediate. The water sounds, previously present even through the stone, fell away. The air changed, stiller, drier. The particular dry of enclosed stone that had not been exposed to the valley's humidity for a long time. She could smell it, the dry stone smell, with underneath it something else, a faint residue that was not quite smoke and not quite mineral, but existed between them, very old, the kind of smell that arrived from organic materials that had been present in a space for so long they had become part of the stone itself. The moss did not grow inside. The light here was different, coming from small vessels set into niches in the wall, 3 of them, each containing a substance that produced a warm, steady glow without flame, not bioluminescent. Denser than that, more orange than the moss's blue-white, the light you would choose for detailed work, for seeing small things clearly. The room was not large, perhaps 4 of Lira's arm lengths across, roughly circular, the ceiling low enough that Cael stood with his head slightly inclined. The floor was smooth, worked, like everything worked here, to the minimum necessary smoothness, no more. A stone shelf ran the circumference of the lower wall at a consistent height. Above the shelf, the wall was covered. She moved closer. Maps. Dozens, rendered in the same brown ink on the same treated paper, some mounted flat against the stone, some rolled and placed in stone-cut niches, some overlapping, all of them the same valley, all of them the same intimate perspective, the inside-looking across view she had identified at the table, each one different in date of making, different in the specifics of what was rendered. Some showed features she had not yet seen in the valley, structures further west along the cliff face, channel configurations that did not match the current system, a broader version of the clearing where the stone table stood, with more seating stones arranged in a pattern she could not determine from the partial rendering. One map, the oldest looking, was mounted in a position of particular attention at the wall's center. Its paper was darker than the others, the beeswax treatment having oxidized over a very long time to a deep amber. The ink was faded but legible, the lines still sharp where the paper had been protected from contact. In its lower right corner, a leaf, 5 fine lines, the same leaf she had been carrying for 3 months. She stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time. The map she carried was not the original. She had suspected this from the age of the paper. It was old, certainly, but not as old as 600 years. What she held was a copy, a careful, exact copy of the original, made at some point a century later, 2 centuries by someone who had stood in this room in front of this wall and reproduced it with the fidelity of someone making a transmission, not an interpretation, a copy precise enough to carry the original's meaning unaltered. She opened her tube and drew out the map she had carried from the archive. She held it beside the original on the wall. The difference in age was clear in this light. The original had the settled quality of very old paper, not fragile, because the treatment had held, but past the stage of change. It had arrived at what it was going to be. The copy she held was younger, still within the range of variation. The ink was slightly darker, the paper lighter, but the marks were identical. The personal notation in its intimate hand, the two leaves in their positions, the triangle of water phrases, the blank central space. Someone in this room had made her copy from this original, had made it with sufficient care that when it arrived in an archive 300 miles away and 300 years later, it was still legible, still accurate, still capable of leading someone here. She became aware of Cael standing beside her. He was not looking at the maps. He was looking at the shelf below them, the stone shelf that ran the room's circumference. On it, at intervals, were tools. She recognized some from the channel's edge. The smoothing implement, the curved form with notches. Others were new to her, all of them worn in the same way, the handled smoothness that came from long daily use. All of them placed with the specific precision of things returned to their positions at the end of work, and between the tools, at irregular intervals, leaves, pressed leaves, their moisture long gone, some reduced to the finest tracery of their veins against the stone. One for each species from the valley, she thought, or perhaps one for each maker, one for each person who had worked in this room and left their mark the way Cael had left his leaf on the stone table. She could not tell from here whether the arrangement was botanical or biographical. Perhaps both. Perhaps that distinction was not one the people who had made this arrangement would have found particularly interesting. Cael crouched before the shelf. He reached into his coat and produced his own journal. He opened it to the pressed leaf from the approach path. The broad 5-lobed elder leaf, dried now, flat, and set it on the stone shelf in the space between two existing leaves. He looked at it there for a moment. Then he stood. It was such a quiet gesture, so entirely without explanation or self-consciousness. Lira felt something shift in her chest, more like the feeling of a door that had been ajar for a long time, finally opening fully. Behind them, Senna had been standing at the room's center. Lira had not looked at her since entering. Her attention had been entirely on the walls, the maps, the shelf. But now she turned and found Senna watching them both with the expression she had come to read, as the closest this woman came to warmth, displayed outwardly. Something in the set of the eyes, the particular stillness of someone who had received what they were waiting for. Lira looked at the original map on the wall. She looked at the copy in her hands. She looked at Senna. She said, as simply as she could, "Someone sent this out." She did not know if Senna understood the words. She said them anyway, because they needed to be said aloud, because saying them was the last step in understanding them. Senna looked at the map on the wall. She reached up and touched its edge, not any specific mark, the edge of the paper itself, the boundary between the map and the stone behind it, where the document ended and the wall began. Her fingertip rested there for a moment. Then she looked at Lira and did something that Lira had not seen her do in the entirety of their acquaintance. She moved her chin, fractionally, downward and back up. The smallest possible affirmation, a nod, pared down to its irreducible minimum. Yes, one word's worth of confirmation, communicated without a word. Lira held the copy out. She was not sure what she was offering. Returning it felt wrong. It was not hers to return. It had been in the world's keeping for 300 years. But she wanted Senna to hold it, to confirm by handling it that the line of custody was real, that the thing in Lira's hands and the thing on the wall were connected by an intention that had survived 6 centuries of distance and disuse and the general indifference of the world's archiving systems. Senna took the map. She did not unroll it. She held it between her palms for a moment, the leather tube warming slightly between her worked hands. Then she handed it back. Lira put it away. She would keep it. That was right. That was what it had been made to do, leave, be carried, be read by someone outside this valley. Her having it was not a mistake, not a theft, not an accident of archive cataloguing. It was the intention from the beginning. Cael was at her shoulder. She turned to look at him and found his face in the warm light of the wall niches, doing something she had very rarely seen it do, opened, in the specific way of a person who had understood something, not with their mind, but with their body. The understanding arriving somewhere below the throat and staying there. He was looking at the shelf of leaves and tools. He was looking at his own leaf among them. She said quietly to him, "We've been guests for 3 months. We just didn't know the invitation had been sent." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the original map on the wall. He looked at the room around them, the tools, the leaves, the dozens of maps in their niches and mountings. 600 years, he said. 600 years, she agreed. And whoever sent it had no way of knowing when, or if. He said it without weight, the way he said most things. But she heard, below the neutrality, the quality of someone genuinely moved by an idea. They just sent it, and waited. She thought of the formal notation section, the translation overlay, the minimum vocabulary, the careful landmark sequence, enough to make it readable, not so much as to over-explain. The restraint of someone who trusted that the right person would find their way here without being told every step. They weren't waiting, she said. Not the way we wait. They just kept the channels clear, kept the maps copied, let it go out into the world, and trusted the world to do the rest. She paused. The same way they maintain the water channels. Not because they know when it'll rain, because they know rain comes. Cael looked at her. She had said something right. She could tell from the way his attention completed itself, the slight forward shift that meant something had landed. He turned back to the shelf. He looked at his own leaf among the valley's gathered ones. "And we came in thinking we were the ones doing the finding," he said. Not bitterly. There was no bitterness in it. Just the quiet recognition of a person who had held a map upside down for a long time and had now rotated it and was experiencing the specific relief of everything finally pointing the correct direction. Lira looked at the original map for the last time, the leaf in its corner, the 5 fine lines, the care with which the pen had rested there at the end of something that had taken years to make. The cartographer, sitting in this room, perhaps at a tool she could not now identify on the shelf, perhaps by the light of the same vessels, in the same niches, working by that dense orange glow, in the dry enclosed air of this space finishing the last marks, drawing the leaf last, after everything else, and leaving it there the way you left a signature, not to claim the thing as yours, but to say that a person had been here and the person had cared enough to be careful. She would never know their name. She had not needed to, it turned out. She had needed instead to understand what they had done and why. And she did understand now, standing in this room in the valley's evening, the moss outside bringing its slow light to the cliff face, the water running its 3 continuous notes through the stone below. They had made a map. They had made it from the inside, with the knowledge of someone who had lived in a place long enough to love it without possessiveness. They had translated it into a language the outside world could recognize. They had sent it out in whose hands, by what path, Lira might spend years trying to trace and might never fully determine. And they had returned to the life of the valley and tended the channels and pressed leaves onto stone shelves and waited in the way that was not waiting, in the way that was simply continuing. And 600 years later, the map had found its way to a woman who knew how to read it, who had climbed down into the valley with a man who knew how to read the ground, who had sat at the stone table and drunk the amber liquid, and understood eventually that they were not here because they had been clever or determined or skilled in the finding of lost things. They were here because they had been invited, a long time ago, by someone who had no way of knowing their names or the century of their arrival. The invitation had been made anyway, with patience, with care, with the assumption that eventually someone would come who would know how to receive it. Senna moved to the room's entrance. She paused there, looking back at them once, not to hurry them, just the look of someone confirming the presence of people in their care. Then she stepped out into the moss light of the cliff face. Lira touched the edge of the original map one more time. The paper was cool and very slightly rough and entirely still. She did not need to take it. She had its copy. She had now what the copy had always been pointing toward, the understanding that made it readable. She stepped back. She followed Cael out of the room and into the evening valley, where the moss was bright enough now to see the channel water by, pale and continuous, running in the direction it had been designed to run 6 centuries ago. Behind them, in the dry enclosed room, the tools rested in their positions, the leaves pressed against the stone. The maps held the valley in their patient interior gaze. The door was not closed. There was no door. There had never needed to be.